Hello and welcome to a special sub-series of episodes dedicated to remembering some of the most bizarrest moments in gaming history. In today's episode, we will be talking about the Overwatch League. But before we get into this video, it is important to understand that this is going to be a little bit more in-depth than your regular poke fun of Activision Blizzard video, because there's a lot more going on here than just the failed esports league. So before you shut off this video and think to yourself, yes, I already know about all of Activision Blizzard's problems, and I know about how much of an asshole Bobby Kotick is, etc, etc, stick around, cause you will learn a few things about the sinister underbelly of the business side of esports, as well as some of the cartoonishly silly decisions that are made behind the scenes. But before I forget, I just need to make a quick statement here. Let's see here. Here it is. I, Cheeky the Panda, am not accusing Activision Blizzard of any illegal activities. Any opinion I make in this video is just my own speculation, and I do not support violence or harassment against anyone working at Activision Blizzard. There, that should keep my lawyers happy. Now let's continue on with the video. So let's just quickly talk about Blizzard's checkered history with esports leading up to the Overwatch League. Now, in the early days, Blizzard had a very hands-off policy, so to speak, when it came to esports. They were more than happy to leave their competitive scene in the hands of third parties like MLG or ESL, and really didn't have much interest in esports themselves. To them, esports was really just an afterthought, and they were much more focused in just developing games. But then came the introduction of streaming. Suddenly, you have millions of people watching your games. The money train started to roll in. But because Blizzard was slow to take advantage of the sudden seas change, rival companies like Valve were able to capitalize off the popularity of Blizzard games, especially a little MOBA game at the time called Dota, and build themselves an extremely successful esports league called the International. Now, obviously, Blizzard wasn't too happy with how things played out and tried to get what they thought was their cut of the profits, which ultimately resulted in an extremely high-profile legal battle over the Dota trademark. But the end result was that Blizzard was essentially left out to dry without any of that sweet esports money. And so, to try and tap into the MOBA popularity, they hurriedly launched their own MOBA game, Heroes of the Storm. They pumped a lot of money to try and get Heroes of the Storm off the ground, but by now there was just too much competition in the market, and ultimately they had to quickly pull the plug. Now, as for their RTS games, they attempted to tighten their grip on the competitive StarCraft scene through the World Championship Series, but found themselves having to work around large sporting organizations like Casper, which established themselves in the early 2000s as Brood War became popular in Korea. And these guys are no pushovers. They were essentially a large player union that had immense leverage in the competitive scene, and by all accounts were extremely difficult to work with. Now, I bring up all of this because it's important to understand the mentality of Blizzard as they got the ball rolling with the Overwatch League. In their heads, they needed to have absolute control over their league from the get-go just to stop other parties from screwing them over, which is clearly an unhealthy way to do business and something to keep in mind as we see how this affects their policies going forward. So, the year is 2016, Overwatch gets released in May and was received as a critical success. Bobby Kotick, who was the CEO of Activision Blizzard, a person with a lot of connections among the wealthy elite, and the kind of guy who never wastes a chance to capitalize off other people's talent, uses this opportunity to pitch the idea of an Overwatch League to his fellow billionaires. The idea was to have a model similar to that of traditional sports, where team owners would have their own franchises associated with a major city. Each team would then travel from stadium to stadium, playing home and away games throughout the entire season, and most of the revenue will be made from ticket sales, sponsorship deals, and merchandising. Now, some of the things to note about this deal is that the team owners are not expected to collect any revenue for the first 3 years, despite having to pay the bulk of the setup and running costs. Like, a team is expected to have their own stadium, broadcasting studio, and production team on top of their player roster and a $20 million entry fee. Now, the way Activision Blizzard justifies this is that they are committing all of their resources to grow the league in the first 3 years, so that everyone gets a bigger piece of the same pie. But in reality, this is just a way to push the bulk of the startup costs onto their partners to offset any real risk to themselves in case the league doesn't take off. Because remember, they had sunk a lot of money trying to start up Heroes of the Storm, which still ended in disaster. They are not willing to repeat the same thing with the Overwatch League. Another detail to note is the $20 million price tag for the franchise slot. Now, as far as I can tell, there was no intelligent method of coming up with that number, meaning that it was only done to establish a high anchor price. And because team owners are expected to bid for these slots, it's extremely likely that many will end up paying an even higher price. And so, it's no surprise that some of the later expansion slots are priced closer to $30 million. Now, this should tell you two things. A, Activision Blizzard was trying to fleece as much money out of this as possible from the very start, essentially putting themselves out of harm's way in case the league doesn't take off. And B, they were very laser focused at aiming this league towards the very wealthy. We are talking groups like Comcast, Opti Gaming, Cloud9, NetEase, as well as investors affiliated with the New England Patriots, New York Mets, Texas Rangers. These are venture capitalist groups and big sports organizations. The point is, Blizzard is just not interested in accommodating this league for your typical endemic team, as there was no way any of them could put out $20 million to participate, and even if they were able to sell their lungs and kidneys to come up with the dough, they'll just get outbid by one of their competitors. Now, something else to point out, while it's no secret that sports organizations have developed an interest in esports over recent years, they are by no means experts and are venturing into uncharted territory. Most of these people have no experience managing esports teams, and they know even less about their audiences. Which is a problem because esports fans are a little different to fans of mainstream sports. Firstly, they're not evenly distributed. You are far more likely to grow a fan base in Asia than you are in Europe or South America. Second, fans tend to follow the best players rather than their teams or franchise brands. So, rely on merchandising sales from a made-up brand name as one of your main income streams is a remarkably foolish thing to do, especially if it's for a game that's yet to prove itself. In fact, the people who do have the know-how were already pointing out these problems, and some were quick to walk away. Groups like Team Solenoid, Denial Esports, Complexity, Red Reserve, and Splice pulled out of the league within the first few months, expressing their concerns specifically with the high franchise fee as well as the revenue strategy, pointing out how just impractical this league was for endemic teams. This is a problem that shouldn't be brushed under the rug, because it takes a very long time for a player to develop the skills needed to become a professional. So you need these smaller endemic teams to both find potential talent and elevate them into the professional scene. Starting a league from the very top without the supporting infrastructure needed to sustain a steady supply of up-and-coming talent is a recipe for disaster. So right off the bat, we are seeing a lot of fundamental problems and skepticism surrounding the league. And so how do you address these issues if you're Activision Blizzard? Let's play What Would Bobby Do? Okay, contestants. I want you to imagine that you're the CEO of Activision Blizzard. You got this crazy scheme for a super expensive esports league that you need other people to pay for, but you don't have anything promising to convince them to go along with your silly plan. Do you? A. Admit that you have problems that need to be worked out and go back to the drawing board? B. Find smarter people who know what they're doing to run your league? Or C. Double down by tricking your business partners with some made up numbers. So it goes without saying that the only thing billionaires care more about than money is their ego. Besides, when it's mostly someone else's money on the line, who cares about things like facts and logic? So buckle your seatbelt, folks. But how do you convince your investors and business partners that your plan won't end in total disaster? Well, why not fund a totally credible, non-biased Morgan Stanley report that makes wild, baseless predictions that the Overwatch League should net $100 million in annual revenue, with the possibility to increase to $720 million once it really takes off. Now, obviously anyone with more than 2 working brain cells can see that these numbers are straitjacket wearing crazy, but hey, when you're throwing figures like $720 million, you're bound to find a few crazy people dumb enough to buy into your bullshit. Let's move on to talk a bit about the game development. Specifically, I want to mention the design methodology because it was very lazy and it was very annoying. So, as most people already know, writing in Blizzard games has steadily been on a nosedive over the past decade. Most of their best writers have left the company long ago, and the people who have stepped in to replace them just haven't delivered to the same standard. So, what do you do as a developer? How do you draw in a massive audience if you don't have the talent to create interesting characters or compelling stories? Well, let me tell you, you go for the low-hanging fruit. First, you create a diverse roster of characters taken from whatever setting comes to mind. Next, give them each a paragraph of backstory to shoehorn them into the game. Don't worry if it doesn't make any sense, as no one's gonna lose any sleep trying to figure out why a schoolgirl is fighting a talking ape in the streets of London. Then, have your characters be progressive enough to cash in on all the various modern societal trends, but not progressive enough to offend any groups that might not agree with those values. And finally, make half your characters gay or trans to score some cheap points on social media. And there you have it. You've done it. Bada bing, bada boom. Now you can market your one-dimensional characters to any demographic you want, without ever having to do the hard work of adding any meaningful layers to your characters that might potentially alienate part of your revenue, I mean audience. Now, obviously, the writing in a hero shooter that's entirely built for PvP was never going to be that important, but it definitely says something about the AAA industry when games like Overwatch can be made in such a soulless manner. Like, games like Overwatch are not made by an artist with a clear intention to either tell a story or deliver a crafted experience. experience, but rather it's made by a boardroom of executives who are essentially ticking off a checklist formulated from market research. Moments of genuine storytelling have been taken out and replaced with some cheap one-liners, all for the sake of scoring some cheap internet points. And as someone who's always had a special place in my heart for video games, this is just depressing to see. Now, that's not to say that there isn't any talent involved in the development of Overwatch, as that would be false. The animation team and voice actors absolutely lived up to their reputation and delivered their A-game. It's just a shame that it's all done in the service of such uninteresting and shallow characters, and this is a big problem for Activision Blizzard, who's heavily counting on these one-dimensional, borderline naughty film characters becoming a cultural hit.
Oh, I spank it to Widowmaker.
Oh, I definitely spank it to Widowmaker.
I'm spanking it to Widowmaker right now.
So, the Overwatch League kicks off in 2018 and pulls in a good 130-ish thousand average viewers at the start, with a peak of around 400,000, which isn't bad. It's a reasonable amount for a new game, but nowhere near the amount needed to meet the projections of the Morgan Stanley report. And just like any competitive esport, a meta quickly develops. Professional players quickly discovered that the best composition to run is triple tanks and triple support, resulting in what could only be described as a bunch of bullet sponges shooting at each other. So much for having a character represent every demographic, am I right? Of course, you can't blame the players for this, they're just trying to win. The problem is just the design of the game. Games like Overwatch just don't draw the same type of excitement you get from other games where the tension of a lucky headshot could swing the entire match. But of course, this is not necessarily a unique problem to Overwatch, as all games go through periods of stagnation. The big problem is just that it takes a very long time for players to develop new strategies, time that the league's investors simply don't have. As anyone with a keen eye can tell, that viewership is taking a significant hit during these periods of stagnation, where we see a rapid decline following the initial hype of the launch down to just above 100,000 viewers. Now, obviously, this is going to be quite a kick in the balls for a team owner who's paying $20 million for a league slot to only see a return of 100,000 viewers with no promise of growth. And so, word of their concerns quickly reached the desks of the people on the top. But what do you do in this situation? You can't just make a bunch of reckless changes to your game without potentially making things worse, but you also don't have the time to let the meta change on its own, as you have a lot of people deeply invested and expecting an unrealistic growth. Let's play What Would Bobby Do? Okay, contestants, I want you to imagine that you're the CEO of Activision Blizzard. You've made some crazy promises to a lot of investors, all of whom are rich and powerful enough to have both your kneecaps broken, but now you're more than a day late and $1 short. How do you rescue yourself from this situation? Do you A. Admit that you screwed up and brace yourself for a new set of legs? B. Find an scapegoat to blame all your failures? Or C. Trick all your investors by fudging your numbers to make your league seem more profitable? Needless to say, Activision Blizzard chose to double down and fudge their numbers. Having trouble retaining your audience? Well, why not just flood your broadcast with tons of meaningless loot drops so that people would just leave your stream running in the background for some free stuff? No luck reaching new viewers? Try embedding your stream into other popular websites to artificially overcount your audience. Still having trouble meeting your quotas? No problem, why not just use a different metric system that inflates the numbers in your favor? The average minute audience, or AMA metric, was used to measure the Overwatch League's viewership, a metric that doesn't seem to be used anywhere else in esports, but hey, who cares as long as it shows a 16% growth in the first year. And don't worry, I'm sure nobody's massaging these numbers in the background just to spin a false narrative. Now, of course, all of this is just lipstick on a pig. The reality of the situation is that average viewership numbers have been dropping on a yearly basis, as many outlets were quick to point out, with a significant drop in 2020, which I will get deeper into as it involves the termination of a $90 million Twitch deal. So, to give a little bit of context, Twitch is a company that is becoming increasingly desperate over the years. It originally started as a streaming platform for gaming content, but over the years has expanded into more questionable areas. Now, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the business model is simply unsustainable. Like, this is a platform that's set up to allow it for anyone to freely stream, yet the vast majority of your content creators barely get any views, meaning that it's really just the top 0.1% that's earning the bulk of your ad revenue. But you still gotta keep the servers running to accommodate everybody, even the ones that's just getting single-digit viewers. And so what you're ultimately left with is an extremely high operating cost for a disproportionately low return. So it's not a big surprise to see Twitch consistently change their policies over the years to try and get a bigger cut of the ad revenue, as well as lay off a bunch of employees on a yearly basis. This is a company that is bleeding out. It's operating at a loss and it's desperate to find a miracle. But then along comes Activision Blizzard, swinging their dicks around with this grand idea for an Overwatch League that it claims will earn a revenue of $720 million. And for the low price of just $90 million, Twitch can get the exclusive broadcasting rights for the first 2 seasons. Now, obviously, spending $90 million on something with no proof of concept is a bit stupid, but given the situation Twitch is in, I think I can understand why some of their board members might be crazy enough to make such a dumb gamble. Although, to be fair, not everybody was on board with this idea. There was at least one smart person working at Twitch at the time that knew this whole thing was a dumb mistake.
I was not able to speak publicly about OWL while I worked at Twitch for obvious reasons. But you better believe that I was the guy in every fucking meeting going, this is stupid and you're all stupid. And every single person that worked on the team at that time will confirm that they got sick and tired of me fucking talking about how terrible of a fucking deal this was for like a year and a half. It did not feel good. I'll tell you why it didn't feel good. Because that league cost a lot of fucking money. And a year later, 11 of my fucking staff was laid off. Right? So I was especially fucking angry that we did this.
You said it, esports Gandalf. Now, obviously, people like Mr. Wheat were clearly in the minority, and so the deal ends up getting through. Twitch ends up broadcasting the first 2 seasons of the Overwatch League, and like we talked about earlier, the numbers were pretty subpar. Twitch gets a serious case of buyer's remorse, and as the second season comes to an end, they decide not to renew the deal. Now, this is a true disaster for Activision Blizzard. Part of the reason why all these team owners were persuaded into throwing so much of their money into this league was because they were promised a large media deal to cover their league. We are talking about something comparable to like an ESPN deal. Twitch was actually their silver medal, but now even your backup plan is not interested in being a part of your league, and so the only viable platform left that's offering anything is YouTube, which reportedly paid $160 million for a 3-year deal that includes all of Activision Blizzard titles. Now, granted, this is a pretty sweet deal for Blizzard considering all things, but the problem is YouTube simply doesn't have the same audience reach as Twitch, especially when it comes to gaming, and the result is a horrific drop in viewership numbers. 2/3 of the audience left in 2020 just from the single move. Needless to say, no amount of lipstick is going to be able to cover up this walking corpse. Okay, so by now the writing is clearly on the wall. Everybody involved with the league now fully understands that the only way to stay afloat is to cut costs. And given the pessimistic outlook, much of the league's top talent decided that now might be a good time to head for the lifeboats. Starting in January 2020, members of the top tier broadcasting teams such as Monte Cristo, Doa, Seminar, Forte, and Chris Bucket announced their departure from the league, citing issues with the creative direction. Now granted, this is probably true, as most of the people calling the shots in the Overwatch League were more used to running mainstream sports than say esports, but this has been the case since day one, so why choose to leave now? My guess, and this is only a guess, is that as the new year rolled over, their new contracts may not have been as friendly as their previous years. Maybe there simply was a pay cut, or perhaps there were a few new terms that weren't particularly well received. Like, oh, I don't know, maybe a clause that prevented them from participating in a rival game, and thus greatly holding back their future careers. But like I said, this is just a guess. But regardless of what you thought about these departures, these people did add a lot of value to the Overwatch League, and losing them is kind of like a knife in the artery at this point. Yet these wounds were humbled by what was effectively a shovel up the butt during what had followed in May when Sinatra, the Overwatch League's MVP, declared that he is now leaving the game for Valorant, a hero shooter which at the time was still in development from Blizzard's old rival Riot Gaming.
That's gotta hurt.
Now, of course, given all the NDAs, it might be a while if ever before we get the full details behind all these departures, but regardless, the optics are terrible. Not only do you have your best on-air talent leave, but also your most valuable player has switched for a rival game, which at the time didn't even have a competitive scene, and his departure must have been quite a big surprise for a lot of people in Blizzard. I know this because Jeff Kaplan, who was the lead director for Overwatch at the time, was teasing about releasing a Sinatra skin during a stream barely a few months before this incident. Like, what do you even do in this situation? Do you still go through with it? That would be like having to give your wife an anniversary gift after finding out she cheated on you. It must have been humiliating. And if all of that wasn't enough overtime for the PR department, team owners who are becoming increasingly desperate for funds are now turning to some rather questionable sponsorships. In July 2020, it was reported that Guangzhou Charge had entered a 3-year sponsorship deal with Herbalife. Now, if you're wondering why that name rings a bell, then here's a clip that might freshen your memory.
I'm talking about multi-level marketing companies, or MLMs. Companies like Mary Kay, Rodan and Fields, New Skin, Amway and Herbalife.
That's right, baby. We're in bed with a pyramid scheme company. Now, granted, it is possible that these team owners simply didn't know, but I'd wager, given how poorly the league is performing, they were probably willing to lower the bar as much as they needed just to stay out of the red. Now, obviously, Activision Blizzard wasn't spared from the heat either. Clearly, somebody had to take the fall, and that someone turned out to be none other than the Overwatch commissioner, Nate Nanzer, who announced that he will be leaving to work for Epic, another rival company, on games like Rocket League and Fortnite due to morale issues. Now, I'm not sure why somebody would go out of their way to announce their new career in a rival company unless the departure wasn't on good terms and they felt like burning some bridges, but of course, this is just speculation. Something fun to note during all these departures was that one anonymous source quoted, "People are really getting tired of working for Pete Vestella. The focus has become commercializing the esports titles instead of making good programs for the community, and it has crushed morale among the Call of Duty and Overwatch teams especially." Now, this is quite interesting because with the departure of Nate Nanzer, the poison chalice that is the Overwatch League is essentially handed down to Pete Vestella, who took on the role of commissioner shortly after Nate Nanzer's departure. So let's keep an eye on him as we move forward. I'm sure all these departures have left the Overwatch League in good hands. Let's play What Would Bobby Do? Okay folks, you know the drill. This time, however, I want you to imagine yourself drowning in a sea of bad news. Your team are quitting en masse, your players are ditching you for your rivals, and even the best spin doctors in the world can't hide the fact that your league is on life support. Do you A. Salvage what you can and pull the plug? B. Fake your own death and pass your problems onto someone else? Or C. Pay your media shields for some cheap publicity? So in the land of dead journalism, where there is no shortage of shills ready to put on their best lipstick at a moment's notice, it's quite easy to find a posse of ass kissers ready to work at discount. Now of course you have the usual suspects like IGN, who's prepared to publish a 10 out of 10 masterpiece review for a game that's been out for 4 years. But honestly, why stop there? Why not shoehorn your game into a long-running TV show such as American Dad? I'm sure it'll be totally seamless and completely non-cringe.
Welcome to China! Home of one big wall, billions of regular-sized walls, and this year's Overwatch Invitational. We are underway. The Americans come out with 3 tank heroes, sacrificing speed for armor.
They must be drawing inspiration from the American bison, their bulkiest indigenous mammal.
Watch out! Here comes a flank from Team Canada.
It's an ambush! Stan, I need healing!
I'm following Hooper.
I thought I was following you!
The entire U.S. team just walked off a cliff. Perhaps a new strategy we haven't seen?
Nope, just really bad.
Okay, so quick recap. We have a super expensive league built around a game with no proof of concept. People are losing interest year after year, there's a mass exodus of your best talent, and all your attempts at scoring good publicity has ended in disaster. Surely there's nothing that could possibly make things worse. So COVID-19 hits out of nowhere, right as the Overwatch League is entering its 3rd year. Everybody is stuck indoors fighting over toilet paper, cinemas are shutting down, restaurants are being looted for leftover french fries, and hey, didn't somebody try to set up an esports league centered entirely around offline events? Now, obviously, having a global pandemic shut down all your offline events isn't great, especially when your business model is built on having ticket sales as your main revenue stream. But given the rapid decline of interest in the Overwatch League, this may actually have been a blessing in disguise. After all, considering how poorly the Overwatch League has been performing, and the fact that team owners were trying to make as many cutbacks as possible just to stay out of the red, having the excuse to broadcast your tournaments online instead of flying your players across the world and maintaining a stadium may have in fact saved everybody some money. But surely there's gotta be other ways to capitalize off this unmitigated disaster. Let's play What Would Bobby Do? Alright contestants, we're nearing the finish line. This time I want you to imagine that you're in the middle of a global pandemic. The whole country is deep in recession, small businesses all around you are beginning to go under, and your own staff are struggling to make ends meet. Do you A. Offer a gift to charity by giving your staff a pay raise during these difficult times? B. Reassess your spending and divert your resources towards more promising projects? Or C. Find a way to capitalize off the situation by taking advantage of government policies. So the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP loans, was an initiative set up by the American government to assist small business owners to help them stay afloat during the pandemic. It was basically designed to allow employers to keep their staff on by covering for their salaries. This was a low interest rate loan of 1% with deferred payments and no collateral. But the most important feature was that its recipients didn't have to pay back the loan if it was used on payroll.
And just look how happy he is.
It should go without saying that maintaining a franchise Overwatch team isn't cheap, and it certainly didn't help now that it was cut off from its main revenue streams. So, it's easy to imagine that many of these team owners weren't too happy with Activision Blizzard's underperformance. Now, Activision Blizzard themselves can't do much to rescue the situation, and so, as a way of making up to the team owners, they decide to help their partners acquire these loans to help mitigate the running costs. Now, obviously, during a pandemic, every business is struggling to make ends meet, but when we're distributing a limited resource, I think it's fair to say that a failing esports league should probably be on the bottom of the priority list when it comes to who should receive this government aid. On top of all that, remember, most of these team owners are backed by extremely wealthy organizations like the FaZe Clan, who at the time had backings from big NFL organizations like Dallas Cowboys. This is a group that's fully capable of raising millions of dollars in funds on its own. In fact, as the Washington Post has pointed out, they were able to raise $40 million in a fundraiser involving athletes and celebrities just April in that year. They are not exactly a small business, which was what the loan was intended for. Yet here they are, taking $2 million from the PPP initiative as a way of making up lost income, which is just plain unethical. And let's face it, if you're an esports team, the pandemic should have been a net benefit for you. Not only are you saving money from travel and production costs, but the fact that large numbers of people are now forced indoors would mean that more people are likely to watch your content. Yet despite this, as we saw earlier, the Overwatch League is among the few in esports who was negatively impacted by the pandemic. And it was all because of a terrible business model. Like $2 million is chump change for these big organizations, but this could have been life-changing money for a lot of small businesses that were genuinely hurt by the pandemic. Alrighty, now might be a good time to talk about Overwatch 2, aka Blizzard's last hope for a miracle. And I know they're all in on the sequel because they're forcing their pro players to play on the beta client years before its official release. But by now, there's quite a long list of problems that needs to be addressed. The game is not very well balanced, the meta is extremely stale, players are starving for content, and team owners are struggling to downsize. These are all challenging problems that require a lot of thought and attention to properly address. It is not a situation where a poorly thought out simple fix-and-more solution can be applied. Yeah, you all see where this is going. So Blizzard decided that changing the format from a 6 vs 6 to a 5 vs 5 is exactly the simple fix-and-more solution the game needs.
Now, like all great plans, my strategy is so simple an idiot could have devised it.
By now, it's pretty obvious that the primary concern of the development team is to accommodate the needs of the competitive scene ahead of anything else, which is not great for those of you who were hoping for some quality PvE content that was promised during BlizzCon 2019. But by this point, if you're a Blizzard and you're forced to choose between dealing with a mob of angry players or a team of angry lawyers, it's pretty easy to understand where their priorities might lie. Now, as for how effective the change to a 5v5 format was on improving the gameplay, one article made a very detailed analysis highlighting the problems with this downsize and concluding that 5 vs 5 is actually the worst possible format for Overwatch, and that even a 3 vs 3 format would have been better in terms of balance. And this sentiment was one that was shared among much of its player base, as demonstrated on both Reddit and Blizzard forums. So it's no surprise that Overwatch 2 ultimately failed to reinvigorate the player base, as was the hope from Blizzard. And given how lackluster the sequel was in terms of content, it's no shock that many were left disappointed, so much so they started referring to the sequel as a patch Overwatch 1.5, and even suggesting that it was a step backwards. But hey, at least the teams get to cut one of their players from their rosters to save some money. So in the end, it's all worth it. So a common trend for big corporations these days is to pander towards progressives, going woke, as the kids call it. And of course, the most common rhetoric that's being thrown around is gender politics. This is no accident, by the way. Big corporations don't want you rallying behind cause for income inequality, or forming unions to promote fair workforce policies. No, see, that all cuts into their profit margins, and they don't want any of that. What they want is to impress you with their stance on LGBT issues, aka the low-hanging fruit of progressive ideology, because it doesn't cost them anything to call an employee a she instead of a he, just as long as nobody pays any attention to the terrible employment practices going on in the industry. Now, obviously, Activision Blizzard is not above such cheap tricks, and Overwatch was a game that was clearly designed with the intention to pander towards progressive culture, which on its own is harmless, like who really cares about the gender or sexual preference of a video game character. But for reasons only known to Bobby Kotick, they decided to specifically extend their arm to social justice warriors, or SJWs, and there's a big difference between progressives and SJWs. As a left-leaning progressive myself, I will tell you that the heart of progressive ideology is about accepting the fact that the world is full of diverse cultures and that there is room for everyone on this planet. It's not about pushing your ideology onto others, which is what an SJW does on social media, often just for some attention. They're the type of people that have a little speech memorized which they can spout endlessly until everybody devolves into a shouting contest. These people are not interested in finding a compromise or having a serious debate, but rather they're the type that would pour gasoline on a fire, so to speak. Now, just to be clear, I don't particularly care who's playing your game, but if I had to pick one group of people that is most likely to get into a fight with gamers, it would be SJWs. Cause let's face it, gamers aren't exactly the most politically sensitive people out there, and most of them tend to see games as an outlet to let loose and say stupid things. So you don't have to be a genius to see that we have a recipe for extreme toxicity within the Overwatch community, and this is why we end up with a lot of silly outrage over incredibly dumb things. Like here's an article about a person getting upset over teabagging, calling it equivalent to sexual assault, resulting in it being banned from tournaments. Like, I can't even make up shit this stupid. Can you imagine somebody showing up to a support group for sexual assault victims and sharing their story of being teabagged in a game of Overwatch? It's straight jackaway and crazy. But these are the type of people Blizzard decided to reach out to as the poster face for their game. Now, I'm not going to go as far as to say SJWs ruin Overwatch, as that's definitely a bridge too far. And besides, I think Blizzard deserves some credit for their hard work on that one. It does, however, make me wonder what's going through the heads of the people calling the shots. But hey, it's not like you have a secret closet of skeletons that's just waiting to be exposed, potentially setting off a powder keg of scandals that will enrage the very same people you tried so hard to please, right? Holy smokes, did we uncover the motherload of scandals. So it turns out that behind closed doors, Blizzard work culture didn't so much resemble one of a games developer, but was in fact more similar to that of a college frat house. You got things like sexual discrimination among employees, secret cameras in restrooms, people stealing breast milk, unsolicited sex in a Cosby Suite hotel, and CEOs threatening to murder employees. It was a PR nightmare. But hey, at least you spent all those years pandering your game towards an audience known for tolerance and forgiveness, right? Oh wait. So amid the mass boycotts, office walkouts, and online rioting, all the sponsors of the Overwatch League decided that now might be a good time to bail. Groups like T-Mobile, Kellogg's, Coca-Cola, and State Farm were quick to distance themselves from this toxic dumpster fire, leaving the league without a single sponsor just months before a new season was about to begin. Now, before you all rush out and start kissing the feet of these large corporations, just know that most of these guys had their own scandals to deal with, and were probably waiting for the chance to abandon this underperforming league without having to face the backlash of walking away from the scene. That's not to say they would have continued sponsoring the Overwatch League had it been performing up to standard, as the allegations associated with this PR mess was so radioactive that even companies run entirely by cockroaches are staying away. Now, I could go into more details on some of the truly horrific revelations, but by now everyone's known about this, and so for the sake of time, I'll just let this montage highlight some of the craziest things that were exposed during the scandal. Alright, now that we got that out of our system, let's talk about the drama in China. Now, when it comes to esports, China is probably the only market where you can guarantee a return. And this is something that even Blizzard themselves have admitted back when they were still trying to lie about their viewership numbers. So given the importance of this vital lifeline, you would think the last thing that Activision Blizzard wants during this period of endless lawsuits and public anger is to sabotage their relationship with China. But clearly, the 300 IQ 4D chess playing grand strategist running Blizzard had other plans and decided that they would go ahead and piss off their Chinese partner NetEase during a meeting. So much so that one participant of this meeting would come out and say, quote, "One day when what has happened behind the scene could be told, developers and gamers will have a whole new level of understanding of how much damage a jerk can make." Now, given the secretive nature of this meeting, it's fair to say that we won't be getting the details of exactly what went down anytime soon, but just to give a quick idea to those of you who don't understand business in China and just how much damage is being done here, the government in China is extremely paranoid about foreign companies destabilizing their domestic economies. They want to make sure that foreigners are complying with their laws, and they do this by forcing companies like Activision Blizzard to partner up with one of their own Chinese companies, which makes perfect sense given their history with the unequal treaties. Now, this is just speculation, but I think it's fair to say that Bobby Kotick is the type of jerk who's used to getting what he wants without considering the interests of others, and so it's easy to imagine a scenario where during this meeting he threw out some unreasonable demand and expected everyone else to just throw their hands up and do as they were told. Now, of course, this is a terrible way to do business even in your own companies, let alone others, and what's worse is that the way business culture works in China is that if you piss somebody off, you also are excommunicated from all their friends too. So the chances of Activision Blizzard partnering up with another Chinese company anytime soon is slim to none, and boy have relations been seriously poisoned. In the immediate aftermath of this meeting, all of Blizzard's games, not just Overwatch, were shut down in China. NetEase even went as far as to tear down the World of Warcraft statue outside of their headquarters. We are talking about some serious bridge burning here. Now, as for how badly this bodes for the Overwatch League itself, well, not only is it now cut off from the biggest esports market on the planet, but also 4 of the Overwatch League's teams are based in China and can no longer legally play the game. This is incompetence in the highest degree, and there is no way to rescue this situation, and so it's no surprise to see the head of Overwatch League leave shortly after this incident. He fully understood where this ship was heading and had no interest in being at the helm when it goes under. But even if you manage to replace him with Rick Sanchez, how do you get around the problem of running a league when all its Chinese participants can't legally play your game anymore? Let's play What Would Bobby Do? Alright, this is it. The last question. Picture this, you're the jerk that's principally responsible for getting your game pulled from China just months before the league is about to start. No Chinese company wants to do business with you, and you need to find a way to get your game back into China. For $1 billion esports dollars, do you A. Come crawling to your long-hated rivals Valve and ask him for help? B. Tell your professional players to pirate your own game? Or C. Tell them to instead use a VPN to bypass the Chinese government? So the only realistic way to get around this debacle was to put Overwatch on Steam, as Valve still has a partnership with the Chinese developer Perfect World, and Fuss is still allowed to distribute games in China. But think about how embarrassing this must be for Activision Blizzard, having to essentially come crawling back to the Chinese market by putting their most expensive game on a rival company's platform, and letting them get a cut of the sales. And this isn't just any company. Remember, Valve was the one that made off with the gold on Dota 2 just decades ago. And here we are again in 2023, Activision Blizzard comes crawling back and handing them another free meal because of their own incompetence. I mean, talk about not learning from your mistakes. And of course, it goes without saying that the community at large is still pretty mad at Blizzard, and so Overwatch 2 became one of the most negatively reviewed games of all time. Not the most important thing, as by now Blizzard's reputation is so low it's practically next to dinosaur bones, but just something funny I thought I'd bring up. At long last, we've arrived at the end of the Overwatch League. The 2023 season limps its way towards a starting point, still without a sponsor. The sequel wasn't a miracle it had to be, and if anything made the game worse. Activision Blizzard is still overwhelmingly hated by the community and still buried in a mountain of lawsuits. At this point, even the willfully blind can see the Overwatch League for the black hole it is, and so the team owners begin to lawyer up. They've had enough of this dumpster fight and want to get off this train wreck before it eats up any more of their money. Activision Blizzard, realizing that this is a battle they probably will lose, caves in and gives them a way out. In July 2023, Blizzard offered each team a $6 million termination fee, totaling $144 million, and gave the team owners the final vote on whether they should continue running the league. This of course was their last pathetic attempt to spin the narrative, as they were essentially trying to pass the blame onto the team owners, saying, look, it wasn't our fault, the teams were the ones that voted to end the Overwatch League. Now, it should be noted that the team owners were still owing approximately $400 million to Activision Blizzard, while these payments have been deferred until after the Microsoft acquisition, and there's still no word on whether how this debt will be collected. I think this is likely a situation that will be settled in court sometime in the near future. Nonetheless, it was still obvious that the sensible thing to do at this point was to pull the plug, and so just like that, the Overwatch League comes to an unceremonious end. Activision Blizzard begins laying off its esports staff nearing the end of July. This of course was followed by an even larger layoff just January this year, with over 1,900 employees being let go ahead of the Microsoft merger, as Phil Spencer begins to downsize the company, leaving just a skeleton crew to keep the servers running. As for the future of competitive Overwatch, well, remember all those third-party organizations like ESL? Yes, that's right, the same ones that Activision themselves tried to push out at the start of this whole venture because they wanted full control over their league? Well, look what the cat dragged in today. Now, obviously there's going to be some changes, as ESL was recently bought by Faceit, a Saudi group, so good luck with all that LGBT pandering, you schmuckos. And as for the PvE stuff that was promised, well, remember how most of the resources were diverted to jumpstart the PvP in time for the competitive scene that ultimately came up Snake Eyes anyway? Yeah, so I wouldn't bet the house on the PvE content being anything other than a lazy attempt to make a quick buck. But hey, if you really want some of that sweet Overwatch lore that was promised to you, then feel free to buy each one in separate DLCs. Does that completely screw over the people who pre-ordered the game thinking that they will get these in advance? You bet your ass it does. But hey, that's why we don't pre-order video games in the first place, folks. So there you have it, kids. The Overwatch League. One of the most expensive failures in esports history. So what do we learn here today, folks? What is something that we can take away from all this going forward? That throwing tons of money at a problem isn't the smartest way to solve something? That you shouldn't always double down? Or maybe that you shouldn't let this prick run your company? Perhaps there isn't a lesson here. Maybe the esports industry is just a big free ring circus run by the same clowns doing the same tricks until the feds show up.